Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to our our February meeting with Bob O'Brien. And first start off, I'd like if everyone would stand and we'll do the pledge.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
States of America,
to
the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you very much. Just a few little notes, just as a reminder, since we are doing Zoom. In a moment, what I'll do, I'll mute everybody, then I'll open up for you, Bob, so you can talk. And when I ask for questions, you can wait till the end and unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put a question in the chat box. Also, if you want, you can also put yourself to stop the video. All that does is take you off the camera. It does not stop the program. Also, we do our memberships coming up, and we could you could send it. Here's a copy of our brochure, and you can send it to Robbie. And also, but you can also go on to our website, which is hersheycwrt.org, and you could actually pay your membership dues there. And the good news, the field trip coming up May the 4th, we have 6 seats remaining. So I encourage anybody who wants to come or who hasn't signed up for it yet, please come. And if anybody's been with Chris Mikowski, you know, you got quite a show going on. So that's going to be May the 4th. And we have good news. We just got through talking with Scott Mingus that Steve did, and he's going to be doing Flings Beyond Gettysburg. So we're going to be following basically Jubal early up from the before Gettysburg, leading up to Gettysburg. And that's going to be, let me get their date right here, October 19th. So we have everything set for that. We got the bus. And so whoever wants to sign up for that, we highly encourage it. And we recommend it because we've had Scott just recently we did Winchester with him, and Scott does an outstanding job. So looking forward for people on that one. Also, just a quick note for tomorrow night is the Harrisburg Civil Roundtable meeting. And if you look on here, I have the date where they're meeting, but also they do have a Zoom if you want to go to Zoom. And John, I might mispronounce Hoptack. He's going to be talking about, like I said, the black soldiers during the Civil War from Pennsylvania, and some were also in the 54th Massachusetts. And again, we have a new Civil Roundtop email address. And with that, Bob, you want to take over? Go ahead, take your share of the screen, and it's all yours. Let me escape out of mine. Let me stop the share. Okay, it's all yours, Bob.
Where's okay.
Okay, you're all set.
1, 2. Okay, well, there we are.
Yep.
Always amazed when this works. This is such an old laptop. It's very temperamental. All right. Well, anyway, thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I've always enjoyed meeting other people with some Civil War interest. And thanks for the nice write-up in your newsletter.
Hey, Bob, go ahead, unmute yourself again. I messed up.
Okay, am I there?
You're good.
Okay. I was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut, and my Civil War interest did start, as it says, around grammar school, 7th grade, 8th grade. That was back when they taught history, of course, in schools, which they don't seem to do much of now. I went to high school in 1961 to 1965, which was obviously the 100th anniversary of all things Civil War. So there was a lot of stuff going on then around Civil War. I collected the Topps 1962 Civil War card set, baseball card company. And at some point they fell victim to my mom's spring cleaning, just like my 1950s Davy Crockett cards had sometime before that. But thanks to eBay, I've been able to recoup them all and do have the complete set. I went to college in Vermont, St. Michael's outside of Burlington. And it's interesting because when I got there in the fall of '65, when I was talking Civil War with someone I met there, I learned about the Confederate raid on St. Albans, Vermont, about 20, 25 miles up the road. And that was in October 1864, and that would become one of the first topics that I researched and spoke about. After law school, I worked as an assistant state's attorney in New Haven for a little over 33 years. And back then, when I spoke to a group of people, it was with the idea of getting them to find somebody guilty. Speaking on Civil War is much more fun and less stressful. My interest was rekindled, I think, by the movie Gettysburg in 1993. And by then, my brother had moved to Kentucky. And I found that when I traveled to Kentucky, especially down I-81 after going through the lovely area of Hershey, I would be near Chambersburg. And so I would make my way over to Gettysburg and spend a few nights. And that really got me going back into Civil War stuff and found the round table. So tonight we're going to talk about Jack Hinson, who was a wealthy plantation owner in what was called then the Tween Rivers area of Tennessee. It's no longer called that because the rivers were dammed up by the TVA, and now it's an area between the lakes. Jack opposed secession by all accounts. And like I said, I read many articles, a couple of books, and there's a lot of difference of opinion between people whether he voted for secession. Some writers claim to have found voting records from the Dover, where he lived, the county seat, that he voted for secession. But most accounts believe that he was against secession, definitely against the war, and he wanted to remain neutral, that he had friends on both sides of the conflict. He was a slave owner, although I've never really been able to determine exactly how many slaves he had. His story was pretty much unknown until maybe 20 years or so ago. A retired Marine lieutenant colonel saw a roadside marker and wondered what the story was behind it, and he decided to research it, and has spent some 15 years before he came out with a book called Jack Hinson's One-Man War, and found that the story had kind of been suppressed. Of course, during Reconstruction, Jack wanted to lay low. He was afraid that the Union was still coming after him. And then after that, a couple generations down, the author found that the family really didn't want to have a guy in the background of their family who had shot and killed what they believed to be about 100 men. So many say that his story is really folklore, which is just oral traditions of legends and myths. A legend, I believe, is something that's historical but not verifiable, and a myth generally is not true. But I'm going to give you the story of Jack Hinson as I've been reading it in various articles and books, and let you determine whether you feel it was a myth or a legend or folklore. This is the roadside marker that caught Lieutenant Colonel McKinney's eye. He was a retired Marine lieutenant colonel, and it ended up leading to his 15 years of research in writing the book, Jack Hinson's One-Man War. He saw this roadside marker, read about it, and realized he never heard anything about this person, wondered what the story was. And so I had seen an ad for the book. I'm not sure where it was. It was a number of years ago. I believe the first edition came out in 2009. And then there was a number of subsequent printings. And I ordered a copy. I read it, found it was quite interesting, and started looking up Jack Hinson, other books and articles. And there's a lot of stuff on the internet now for him. As you see, this roadside marker is in Golden Pond, Kentucky, not to be confused with the Golden Pond where Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn hung out back in 1981. The author, Tom McKinney, found that the story, is in the words he put it, was suppressed. In an article he wrote that it's been deemed an extremely difficult job, first and foremost, that the events occurred 140 years ago. And second, the story has been suppressed since the war years by the family. He said the story's suppression was motivated in the beginning by fear of occupying Union forces retaliation during Reconstruction. And 2 years later, the time of Jack Hinson's grandchildren, some family members considered the old man's exploits to be an embarrassment since he had been, in a sense, an outlaw, a wanted man with a price on his head, and a notorious killer. And in a locally prominent family, which the Hinsons had become, he became a topic not to be discussed, and silence settled over his story. He goes on to say that the deaths that occurred of the Hinson children and the soldiers he killed were actually all real, and that in his mind, he has rescued a compelling historic and human story from our past. John W. Jack Hinson was known as Old Jack or Captain Jack. The captain was not a military rank. It was just more of a sign of respect. He was born in 1807, North Carolina. He married Elizabeth James around 1835. Elizabeth was a cousin of Jesse James. And they had moved to the Hinsons had moved to Tennessee around 1830. That was the only known photo of Jack. It's undated, although he does look more elderly. And you'll see it from time to time during my presentation. I just use iPhoto to flip it around, make it look a little different, but I know I can't fool you. So I'm admitting right now it's always the same photograph that you're going to see. His description was he's not a tall man, 5'5", with unusually long and muscular arms, serious, strong-willed, erect, gazes steady, courtly, and genteel manners for the raw frontier, quiet man, spoke sparingly. Relatively small size concealed a combination of great strength and cool courage, if not outright menace. The last couple of paragraphs came from a description of him by Nathan Bedford Forrest, adjutant officer, Major Anderson, that he had clear gray eyes, compressed lips, and massive jaws. He was never boastful nor conspicuous, but demonstrably without fear. He was a man not to be trifled with. And as we go on, we learn that that's true. Jack and Elizabeth settled in Stewart County, Tennessee, the county seat of Dover. In 1847, he acquired 400 acres of land on Lick Creek. That would become their permanent home, and they'd eventually expand to over 1,200 acres, and they would call their home Bubbling Springs. He grew tobacco, other crops, and again, he had some slaves, and his family grew, and his wealth grew as well. So this is a outline of Bubbling Springs. You can see, if I can get my little arrow going, there it is. The Hinson house is down in this left corner here. Slave cabins were here. It looks like Jack had a toll road that went along his property. This gentleman, Albert Rougemont, was a neighbor. There's been some conflicts with Jack. I'm not going to get into all that, but he met an untimely end in December of 1862. Jack was kind of a suspect, but nothing was ever pursued as far as I can tell. This house here is the Crisp House. Depending which book or article you read, some say that Ulysses Grant used Jack's house as his headquarters when he was in the area. That doesn't seem to be true, although there is the stories that he stayed there, got to know Jack Hinson, but that he actually used the Crisp House up here in the top of the drawing as his headquarters when he was there. And actually from the hill by the Crisp House, you can see Fort Donelson. This is an artist's rendition of what Jack's plantation, Bubbling Springs, looked like. It's located on a grassy valley between gently rolling hills, about 3 miles southwest of Dover. And that's just a floor plan of the first floor, the main floor of Bubbling Springs, where the master bedroom was located, along with the parlor, the library, the dining room, and the breakfast nook and the kitchen. And I guess all the kids ended up upstairs. This is a map or sketch of Dover, Tennessee. It's right, as you see, it's right on the Cumberland River. Jack Hinson had a grocery store, which was number C down here. This is the courthouse square. This is number D, letter D, excuse me. And Dr. Smith's office, which is G, is right next to Hinson's grocery shop. Smith was a good friend of the Hinsons. And then if you went down to River Road, which naturally ran by the river, the Cumberland River. The grocery store was built around, I believe, around 1858. It sold produce from the farm and a ham as well. It's apparently some cured meats. And, that's a drawing of Hinson's grocery store. What it was, Bubbling Springs' big advantage was that the spring was named Bubbling Springs because of the cool spring that ran through it, which also cooled things, and they kept the food in the spring house would keep it cool. And there's always a constant source of cool water. Jack could sell his goods here at the store, but also with the being right on the river and also a railroad nearby, he had means to ship his goods to markets elsewhere as well. At the start of the Civil War, he was a successful and wealthy farmer. He owned a number of slaves. Now, he freed the slaves. The best information is that he freed them in September of 1862. What's happened is the Union had come in, you'll see earlier in 1862, and pretty much took control of the area by the fall. And they were taking slaves from the slave owners. Jack wasn't sure what they were doing with them. They may have been using them for manual labor. But in any event, he didn't want his slaves confiscated as slaves, so he freed his slaves. And by all accounts, most, if not all of them, decided to stay and work on Bubbling Springs. By this time, he and Elizabeth had at least 10 children, 8 sons and then 2 daughters. And 8 of the children were still living there. The 2 oldest sons, Robert and George, had moved out on their own. Jack was sued politically, but wanted no part of the war that he knew was coming. The problem was he lived in a very strategic area, and war was going to be inevitable. He was determined to stay neutral and to work for a while. And as I say, he even got to know Ulysses S. Grant. But his sons, 2 of his sons went and joined the Confederates. One joined the 14th Tennessee Infantry. Another joined a group of guerrilla partisans. And there's the list of the 10 children that he has. You notice finally had 2 daughters after having 8 sons, Mary and Sarah. And Robert and George were the 2 that had moved out. So 8 of them were still living at Bubbling Springs at the time that the Civil War broke out. Now, this story of man not wanting to be involved, being in the middle of the Civil War, but not wanting to be involved in the war is a familiar one. And in fact, when I was talking with Ricky the other day, he recognized right away that it sounded very similar to a movie that most of us have probably seen back in the day. And that was, I'm sure you all know what movie this is from, but the character Charlie Anderson, played by Jimmy Stewart in the movie Shenandoah, was another farm owner who wanted to stay out of the war with all of his children, and it just didn't work. They ended up being involved with tragic results. And that's what happened to Jack Hinson. This is a map of Kentucky and Tennessee. The area we're talking about, if you can follow this, I'm sorry it's kind of small there, but you can follow my arrow. It's a green area here. The area between the rivers is this area right up here, right on the border. And the yellow, the one that's highlighted in yellow, is Clarksville. And then Dover is to the left over here. And then from Clarksville, you can come right down to Nashville. And I'll show you those in more detail in a minute. But Jack lived in that area. It was called Tween the Rivers. And that's the Tennessee and Cumberland River. The Mississippi ends up flowing out over that way. That's how now gone. There's 2 lakes there now, Lakes Kentucky and Barkley Lake, and Kentucky Lake. And it's known as Between the Lakes. It's a 40-mile long peninsula and a great recreation area. My brother moved to Kentucky about 30 years ago, and he says he's been camping out there. It's really a beautiful area. Grant came in February of 1862 for the assaults on Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. He got to know Jack. He visited him. As I said, I don't believe he used Jack's place as headquarters, but some people do. But he may have stayed there. And this is an illustration showing Jack meeting with Ulysses Grant. And Grant was a guest at Bubbling Springs. Most accounts seem to bear that out. This is another map of the area. And now you can see a little clearer. Here's Dover. This is where Jack lived on the Cumberland River. And this is the Tennessee River coming down the other side. So the area between the rivers starts up here and runs all the way down. And that gets over to Clarksville and Nashville, and you get into Tennessee. And then you can get up into Kentucky, Hopkinsville, and Bowling Green. So Dover is right on the river, as is Clarksville. And then this shows the rivers in more detail. The Cumberland, the Tennessee, Dover, as you can see, is on the river. And it's on the railroad, which gave Jack means of transporting his goods to market. And then if you continue down the railroad, see to Clarksville. And then we go from Clarksville, you can continue on to Nashville. The Union forces under Ulysses Grant take control of the area. They're taking Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Fort Henry is over here on the Tennessee River. On February 6th, the federal troops moved in on Fort Henry. Federal gunboats fired on the fort, which drove most of the Confederates out, sending them over here to Fort Donelson. And Fort Henry is captured. Now, Admiral Foote's gunboats, Admiral Foote, New Haven, Connecticut guy, his gunboats did the damage there. And so that fort was surrendered on February 6th, even before Grant's infantry had arrived in any force. Attention was then turned to Fort Donelson, and initially the Union was repulsed, but on February 16th, gunboats returned and bombarded the fort. You can see gunboats in the river. It's Fort Donelson here. And Confederate generals Pillow and Floyd took off, leaving Simon Bolivar Buckner in command. He would be later, he'd be a governor in the 1880s, a governor of Kentucky. Another one that fled from Fort Donelson rather to be captured was then a little known colonel known as Nathan Bedford Forrest. Buckner agreed to Grant's demand for unconditional surrender, and it was really a first major victory for the Union. Lincoln would promote Grant to Major General of volunteers, and the press would call him an unconditional surrender grant for U.S. Grant. The result was Union control of a very strategic area and paved the way to Nashville. About 12,000 Confederates were captured. They lost the rivers, they lost the railroad. Kentucky was now out, and the Union controlled central and middle West Tennessee. And Fort Donelson was a vital gateway into the Confederacy. That's a map of the Battle of Fort Donelson. It's located on the river here. And again, you can see Dover, where Jack's lived, is over here. In this painting of the battle, you can see the Union troops, infantry assaulting the fort, but you can also see over here on the left-hand side between the trees and over here, the federal gunboats, which were an important part of the success of the Union in taking Fort Donelson. Fort Donelson today is a national park. I believe this is called the Lower Battery, and if you visit it, you can see the cannons in place, but nothing to shoot at them now this time. This map shows all three forts that the Union ended up taking: Fort Hyman, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and then Clarksville here is the county seat of Montgomery County. Very strategic, as you can see. It's also on the river. and it's on the railroad that leads down to Nashville. On February 17th, the USS Cairo, which if you go to Vicksburg, you can see it. They have it on display there. Came and captured Clarksville. The rebels had left. They had defense for ground attack, but really no defense against bombardment from the river. Nashville would then fall on February 23rd, becoming the first Confederate state capital to fall to the Union. And obviously, again, that was due unto the strategic value of Clarksville and how it opened the road further east for Grant to continue to move. If you were fortunate enough to catch the last train to Clarksville, you might have met these guys at the station. I don't believe that's the right Clarksville. I know you're humming it in your head. I just had to put it up there for you. Now with Grant having successfully taken the forts in Clarksville and Nashville, he declared martial law in the state of Tennessee, and he moved on with his army, leaving what became occupied territory now. And occupying troops tended to be less disciplined and more poorly trained than your frontline troops. So that was what was in charge now in Stewart County. And the 5th Iowa Cavalry was stationed in Dover, Tennessee. And they were under the command of Colonel William Warren Lowe. And he expected his troops to show no mercy to suspected guerrillas or their families or neighbors. And that was the Union policy. If you were caught as a guerrilla or as a bushwhacker, not only would they deal with you, but they felt they had the authority to go after your family or your neighbors. Including one of his companies was apparently a group called the Irish Dragoons. And I hate to admit, when fellow Irishmen behaved poorly, they sound like they were the worst of the bunch. So that was Colonel Lowe's no mercy policy, in particular for bushwhackers. What is a bushwhacker? Well, it's a form of guerrilla warfare during the American Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and other conflicts, where there were large areas of contested land and few governmental resources to control, particularly prevalent in rural areas during the Civil War, and that's what we're dealing with here. And there were sharp divisions between those favoring the Union and Confederacy. They were called bushwhackers, and it's still in use today to describe ambushers done with the aim of attrition. And so you were caught and considered to be a bushwhacker, you could be summarily executed. They were not considered guerrillas. Like Robert Hinson, I believe one of his sons led a band of guerrillas. They operated on their own. They had no uniforms, but they didn't bushwhack troops. They were more cut telegraphs, tear up railroads, burn bridges, etc. The bushwhacking was a form of just killing from ambush. The war comes to Bubbling Springs in the fall of 1862. Two of Jack's sons, George, who was 22, and John, or Jack, who was 17, were deer hunting about a mile from home when they were caught by Union patrol. They were tied to a tree and shot, summarily executed for being bushwhackers. Their bodies were dragged to the town of Dover. They were then beheaded, and the bodies were left hanging in Dover, and the heads were taken to Bubbling Springs and placed on fence posts there. You can see the soldier in the back putting one of them on the fence post. And Jack had been forewarned. A friend had come out from Dover to tell him what had happened, so he remained cool. This lieutenant from the 5th Iowa was tried to provoke him. They searched for other weapons, acting under their mandate that they could actually not only deal with the bushwhackers, but with the bushwhackers' family. At some point, he backed off, however. Maybe he became aware of the fact that Jack had a relationship with General Grant back in the day. But they ended up leaving Jack alone, which in the end proved to be a big mistake. Jack went and ordered a rifle. He ordered from a gunsmith in a nearby town. I believe he was a former Confederate soldier who had been wounded, captured, and paroled, and was no longer fit for duty. Jack wanted a custom-made long rifle for what he felt would be his revenge for his son's death. It could shoot up to half a mile, but most of the Jack's shots in the end would be within 300 yards. Some as close as 50 yards. He was an expert on concealment. And also, whenever he planned to go out and do some of his bushwhacking, he put himself in a position to be able to quickly escape. It was an octagonal rifle barrel. It was over 40 inches long. It weighed between 17 and 18 pounds, and it fired 50 caliber mini balls. The metal plating on his rifle was subdued to avoid detection, so there'd be no reflection from the sun giving away his shooting point. The only bright spot on the gun was a silver tip type of bead on the front sight that he would lay on his target. And while waiting for his rifle to come in, he was able to study the Union patrols in terms of their size, their weaponry, and the routes that they would take. He knew who he wanted to go get, and so he used the time waiting for his rifle to prepare. The rifle was too heavy to be fired without support, either the tripod of a tree branch or a trunk, or a rock, something needed to keep it steady. You can see on the front sight here that the silver bead used sight. And, finally, his gun was ready. And it was about April of 1863. And he went out in search of his first victim. And that was the lieutenant of the 5th Iowa who had led the patrol that killed his sons. It does sound kind of fanciful, but that seems to be the prevailing story, that was, in fact, his first kill. And the second kill was the sergeant who had placed their heads on the fence post. The Union's going to come after him, he knew, and his family, they had sent west, about 40 miles west into Henry County, about 40 miles away, so they would be safe, and he could close up Bubbling Springs, which eventually was burned down by the Union. His slaves were already freed, and they stayed on the land and continued to work the land. And Jack would go down and down to the rivers and find a cave. There were actually 2 caves on the river that he used. One as a hiding spot from when he was shooting, and the other one was a larger cave that he could stay in from time to time. And he also obviously got help from some of the locals when he embarked on his revenge. That's a person named Larry Ray. He's an author of Civil War articles. He's up in Jack's cave that overlooks the river, and it looks towards a place called the Tullhead Chute. Union River traffic was very substantial. It was the rivers were a major transport hub for both supplies and soldiers, and would provide a lot of targets for Jack, and he could safely shoot at from a good distance. And this is one of the caves that he used. This is the upper cave. This is a map of the area showing the Tennessee River. Here is Jack's Ridge. A is Jack's Cave. That's the upper cave that Mr. Ray was sitting in. Down below is a lower cave down in at C. And B is a ledge that he would use to shoot. And there's a railroad, there's the roadway, and then there's another creek that runs off here, Hurricane Creek. The important thing is he would shoot boats when they were in this section of the river, which is called the Towhead Chute. You can see the arrows are pointing northbound, and give you a little bit more to the thing that made his firing point perfect was their location of the river's channel. On the far side of the river, there was a large island called Hurricane Island. You can see over here. A second smaller island near the east bank called Towhead is there. The channel, which the big boats had to follow in order to avoid running aground, turned in towards the bluff and ran between Towhead and the bank. So you're talking where the arrows are here. That's what they call the Towhead Chute. The passage was narrow, close in, and the current was swift and powerful, heading north. At this point, much of the power of the Great River was concentrated, forced through the narrow passage, which is called the Towhead Chute. Northbound boats going downstream would rush through the chute at breathtaking speeds, almost like whitewater rafting, it sounded like. And that's where they get the name the chute. For the southbound traffic, however, the opposite is true. When the river was running full in the winter and the spring, the current in the chute was more than they could overcome. As a result, southbound boats only had to pass under Jack's Bluff. They moved so slowly as to be almost standing still. For Jack, it was perfect. For those on the boats, it was perfectly awful. A deadly gauntlet they were forced to pass through at very low speed for a very long time. And that's where Jack was able to pick them off from his ridge. That's kind of what it looks like. Jack picking off target at 600 yards. Now they know that the boats were about 600 yards away. At one point, the author of Jack Hinson's One-Man War, along with the current owner of Jack Hinson's rifle, went up to the cave and up to the ridge and used a laser finder to sight the distance, and that's what they came up with between 500 and 600 yards. And of course, if anybody came looking, Jack would disappear. He knew the woods like the back of his hand. Another illustration, and you can see he's on the side of the river. So right below him is the road, the river road, and the railroad, and then the chute between the island and the bank. Now, there's a story that he was almost caught one day in a place called the 100-acre Field near Bubbling Springs. He was on his way back, and he spied what he thought was a Union patrol. It ended up being just two soldiers. You can see them illustrated here. And he was able to quickly lean over and drop his rifle into the high grass. The gun would have been a giveaway that he was the sniper that people were looking for, because obviously it was not a squirrel hunting gun. And there was no wanted posters showing what he looked like back in the day. But he felt that if he turned around and tried to run away, that would look guilty and they would pursue him. It turned out not to be a full patrol, but two soldiers. And he rode up to them innocently, and they said they were out looking for Jack Hinson, and he told them, oh yeah, I saw him a little while ago, he's over there, and sent them on their way. Another part of the story has him retrieving his gun and actually going after the soldiers and shooting them. But I'm not quite sure that really happened as well. But there's no question that he did have a close encounter. Another story that seems to have a lot of truth behind it is that one time he was shooting at a boat in the Towhead Chute that had practically standing still and was picking soldiers and sailors off and peppering them with bullets to such extent that the captain raised a white flag and pulled over to shore, planning to surrender what he thought was a superior Confederate force. But it was just Jack, and Jack just went on his merry way and left the boat sitting there. During the time Jack pursued his vendetta, of course, there were instances of guerrillas who were preying on local citizens instead of fighting the Union. And there were stories of some of them meeting an untimely end. And some people credit Jack with taking out some of these bad guys. But that's never been really proven conclusively. No one knows for sure. But obviously some of these guerrillas were not interested in much in supporting the Confederacy as they were attacking defenseless citizens. And if they made it on timely end, they probably deserved it. Now, Jack started doing some scouting in the fall of 1864 for Nathan Bedford Forrest. There's possibly 3 occasions that we're aware of. One was in the fall of 1864, raids over the area to try to disrupt Union supplies near Nashville, and then Forrest's 23-day raid to check Union in advance through Georgia by cutting supply line. But the one we know for sure was the Battle of Johnsonville, which was November 4th, 1864. Johnsonville was a big Union supply depot on the river, Tennessee River. And Jack was able to guide the Confederate artillery through the swamps in the area to a position where they could shell Johnsonville, which resulted in the depot being destroyed. Forrest reported capturing, it's pretty much accurate what's on the sign, about 28 boats and barges. The sign doesn't mention artillery, although Forrest in his report indicated he captured 26 artillery pieces, caused a lot of damage. 95,000 tons of quartermaster stores were destroyed, which was valued in anywhere from $2 to $6 million. And they also took 150 prisoners. But even with all that damage, it was only a temporary setback, and the Union was able to recover and push on. That area is now under Kentucky Lake as a result of it being flooded by the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1940s. But that, though Jack never really officially joined the Confederate Army, he did do some work with Forrest towards the end of the war. This is Major Charles Anderson, who was Forrest's adjutant. He wrote many of his speeches, including his farewell to his troops. And he was given Jack's rifle by Forrest. Jack had left his rifle when the war ended. He left his rifle with General Forrest, and it has been passed down through Major Anderson's descendants since. If I have show you how it got to where it is today. Hinson gave it to Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Forrest gave it to Charles Anderson of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Major Anderson had no children while he was still living. He gave the rifle to his brother-in-law, Mr. William T. Love. When Mr. Love died in 1916, he passed the rifle to his daughter, Frances Virginia Love. Excuse me. Who knew Major Anderson as Uncle Charlie. She married and became Frances Virginia Love Black. She left the rifle to her daughter, Eugenia Maria Black McFarland, with written instructions that the rifle gives to her grandson, Benny. The gun goes to Benny. Eugenia Murphy's son, Judge Ben Paul McFarland of Murfreesboro. And the rifle is now in the hand of Judge McFarland, and we'll see him very shortly. Rifle barrel has these tiny circles punched into it, and there's been speculation about what they actually mean, that they denote kills. According to Major Anderson, he did have a conversation with Jack Hinson, and yes, they do. But there are 36 of them, and some believe that they only reply to officers or kills that Jack was able to personally verify himself. He is believed to kill much more than 36. According to the author of the Jack Hinson One-Man War book, the Union military records blame him for about 130 kills, which is probably too many. It's more like maybe 100 or so. And in the post-war, Jack settled with his family in Magnolia, which would be what would become Houston County. It wasn't Houston County at the time of the war, just south of Stewart County. And it became Houston County in 1871. He ran a mill with his son, that may have been Albert, and kept a low profile. He was always concerned that the Union would come after him, but they in fact did not. He died while at his residence on White Oak Creek on Tuesday, April 28th, 1874. A very sudden death. In that morning, he complained of severe pain between his shoulders and got no relief until he died about 6 hours after being taken. They believe it was meningitis. Now, this is a obituary from the Clarksville Weekly Chronicle, which says he's buried on Bear Creek. Mr. Joel's on Bear Creek. And this stone was placed there by his son, great-great-grandson. It's a Confederate style with the point there. But there's also a marker in Cane Creek Cemetery, the Hinson family cemetery, where one of his sons is buried. People think that's just a memorial. Some articles you read say that's where he's buried. One problem with this marker is that it has a long date. He died in 1873. This is Judge Ben Hall McFarland Jr. of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I will tell you that in 33 years being a prosecutor, I never saw a judge carrying pistols like that. I only knew of one judge that was carrying a pistol for his own protection. And that's him with Jack's rifle, which makes rare appearances. He is the great nephew of Major Anderson, which is how the rifle came down to him. The rifle comes out on rare occasions like book signings, round table meetings, and historical society meetings. It's not operable. To have it fire now would be change it too much to restore it. This is one of those rare occasions where the rifle made a public appearance with Judge McFarland. Mike Couch, who is the director of the Museum and Library of the Confederate History at Greenville, South Carolina. And then over here is Colonel Tom McKinney, who wrote the book, Jack Hinson's One-Man War. McKinney, as we say, is a retired lieutenant colonel from the Marines. He got to examine and check out Jack's rifle. If you really have become a Jack Hinson fan now, you can order a Jack Hinson t-shirt. They're available from the Dixie Republic, which is located in Travelers Rest, South Carolina, which credits him with over 100 kills. And the toll of war would be very heavy. During the course of the war, 7 of Jack's 10 children died, including his 2 young daughters. His daughters died from measles after he had moved them west, and then he's lost 5 sons. 2 of them were executed by the Union, as we know. 2 of them, one was a Confederate soldier killed at Petersburg. Another was a Confederate soldier paroled and died of malnutrition and exhaustion. And then one was on a guerrilla band that was killed during battle. And on the other hand, his revenge for his son's executions took the lives of probably 100 or so Union soldiers and sailors. And if you look at those, are all brothers, sons, fathers, husbands. It's just a huge toll of lives for what happened there in Tennessee. So was he a hero or was he an outlaw? Was it okay to kill the guys who had killed his sons, even though he was not formally officially a soldier? He's called a Confederate sniper. Obviously, he was shooting Union troops. Is it okay to kill those, the sergeant and lieutenant? Or was it okay to go beyond them because the Union had a policy? That was a policy of execution without trial, of summary execution. So Jack was not considered a soldier, which is why he always feared retribution, which never did come to him from the Union. Either they gave up looking for him or they just couldn't find him. He was able to live a number of years after the war before he died. These are some of the sources that are used in findings information about Jack. Some interesting YouTube videos and the 2 books on top that I've mentioned. And if anybody has any questions, I will try to answer them.
Okay, yeah, if anybody has a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. Go ahead, Joe.
I can't believe, Bob, by the way, great presentation. I knew very little about this before you started, but good story. I am fascinated with the fact that the Union Army, after taking so many casualties in that area, didn't have some kind of a group standing by every time they were running the rapid area or unrapid area to maybe catch this guy. I mean, it's like they just put up with it and figured that was sort of the price of the war.
Yeah, they tried. They did try that at one point, but it just didn't work. I don't know if they couldn't get up to where he was or what it was, but yeah, they you know he knew where he was going, I guess, and yeah, for obviously that was a very vulnerable area, and they took a lot of casualties there, and you think they would have done something more to protect it, but again, those are not the frontline troops that they really needed maybe to catch a guy like him.
I was in military intelligence. Maybe they could have used Colonel Sharp out west to try to find this guy. Hey, well done. Good program.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, very good. Anybody else have any questions?
I have one.
Go ahead.
Looking at the picture of the rifle, it looks like a lot of the screws that held the internal guts of the rifle were removed. Do you have any sense whether that was done purposely so the gun would never be fired again, or somebody was playing gunsmith, or what?
It's possible. As I say, the rifle was passed down. In fact, at one point, the rifle almost was lost in a fire. It was saved by someone who grabbed it on the way out the door. But I think that's what he was referring to when they asked the current owner if he could get it restored to firing condition. They said it would just require too much. So yeah, obviously parts have been taken off it. He doesn't want to let it go.
Well, thank you.
He says he can't put a price on it because it's a one-of-a-kind deal.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
That now it has a story people know behind it. You know, for the longest time he's just kept it, but he takes it out and yeah, he brought it to various round tables down there. Have had discussions since Jack's story's become more well known. Sounds like he gets more publicity down there, but yeah, I'm not that familiar with the rifle. I just know that it, you know, it worked when he needed it, I guess, but who knows what care it had for 100 and something years.
Right.
Probably well taken care of now, but until Judge Ben got it, who knows where it was. It might have just been in the closet somewhere gathering dust.
That's where they often end up till they're picked up by somebody who cares with them. Well, thank you. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for anybody? For Jack? For Bob? Jack's not talking. He's dead.
I have a question for you if you're interested. I can.
Sure.
At one of the, there's a couple of YouTube talks on it. Kind of interesting because it's from the Southern perspective. So, you know, he's always a hero. And it's really an interesting moral question because, you know, he killed 100 and something guys. You could see where the family might not want him in the family tree at some point. But the question was raised and no one really answered. They asked the guy who currently owns the gun and suggested that it would be him. But if they were ever to make a movie about Jack Hinson, who do you think should play Jack Hinson?
That's a good one. In the old time, I'd say Sam Elliott would be an excellent one, or Tom. Oh, geez.
How about Chris
Magnet.
Walken?
He'd be a good crazy one.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting question. I gotta say, that was raised at one of the talks that Ben McFarland had given, but they never really they thought about it, but never came up with anybody.
Bob, just a quick one. If you could, send me an email with the YouTubes that, that talk about this, then I could pass on to my members. That sounds interesting. Look at some of those YouTubes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
There's one where Judge McFarland had, I remember seeing that one, and I believe there's another one. And
Yeah, 'cause I could,
I'll send them on to you. We can quick note.
good, I could pass that along. Anybody else have any other questions before we close out? Okay, again, Bob, thank you very much. Fantastic information. I'm either gonna have to buy the book or I'm gonna talk to Mr. Tom Lehman and borrow his book to get it. That looks really interesting.
Well, normally I would give away a copy of the book, but I don't have one here.
It's hard to pass through eBay. Yeah. Yeah. Next month we have Cooper Wingert, who is what used to be one of our own, and we actually have the honor. Cooper Wingert gave a talk when he was 13 years old. Very first talk he ever gave it to a round table, and
Wow.
he's now working on his his PhD in history. And Bob, if you get a chance, or he's another one to get a hold of. He'd been an excellent speaker for you. He's got a lot of different topics. And this one is, like I said, the Confederate approach to Harrisburg. And how he got that one is there was a book years ago, Here Comes the Rebels. And both between Cooper and Jim Schmick looked at it, and it was outdated. They wanted to update it. And that's how Cooper's book came into existence. And it's fascinating. So you learn more about what happened, what happened before Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And so this one it's going to be live, but it's also going to be Zoom. So for everybody, like I say, for the rest of this year, we're going to do both Zoom and live. So I'll be sending out information, but again, encourage everybody. We hope to see you next month, either live or Zoom. And Bob, again, fantastic talk. We really enjoyed it. Gave us a lot of good information.
All right, I'm glad to do it. Nice to meet you guys, and I'll try to drop in. Do you meet all year, Ricky, or do you take the summer off?
No, the only time we don't meet is December because it's too close to Christmas.
Oh, okay.
So it's always, I think you're on the email list, but it's always the third Thursday. We'd love to have you come down and visit with us.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping to get back to Gettysburg this year. Just didn't make it last year for the first time in many years.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
it's getting old. That's the trouble.
That's one of the things about it.
Well, the Rolling Stones said it best back in 1967. They started one of their songs with the verse, "What a drag it is getting old." And
Oh yeah,
I say, they knew what they were talking about.
that's for sure. But
All righty, well, yeah, I'll definitely the Confederate approach to Harrisburg. It sounds interesting.
okay, so again, good night, everybody, and we'll see everybody next month.
Next month. Okay.
Night all.
Right.
Yep.